This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, an international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. In this new series, I talk to coaches, leaders and experts who share their passion for this incredible profession and their knowledge of how to do marketing well. Our ambition is to contribute to the development of the coaching profession and to bring you some new ideas, insights and strategies so you can create an impact with your coaching and marketing. Today, we're going to talk not only about making time for your marketing, but also how to widen your net whilst doing so. My guest today is speaker, business coach and award-winning author of 3 books, including her latest book called The Widest Net, which was the Porchlight Sales and Marketing Book of the Year 2021. She hosts the Widest Net podcast and has been writing a blog since 2004 and has been a management consultant and former corporate director of training and development at Barclays Global Investors. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today from Mesa in Arizona, Pamela Slim. Pam, welcome to the podcast.
I am so happy to be here.
It's great to have you, Pam. So let's start here just to give our listener, who may or may not know you, a bit of an insight as to who Pam Slim is. Let's begin by asking you what marketing means to you and how does marketing show up in business for you in your life?
Marketing for me is a love that I did not know that I would have. One of those I didn't see it coming when I was growing up and going to school. I've always been really passionate about social change and community building, learning and development. I know you and I, and having a long-term friendship, have talked about our past experience being consultants, where we just really love passionately designing programs and systems that really help people to do great work. What I learned about marketing once I really began to lean into the work that I was meant to do is it meant it was an avenue and a vehicle for first connecting with amazing people who I never would have connected with before, which is my whole online journey in the last 15 years of building an online community. And the second thing is just recognizing that it's always through the lens of what work is being done. When there's really interesting work to be done, it's more fun to do it with other people, including people who are paying you to be building that work with them as clients. So that's always what the door and the avenue is with me, is marketing can shed light on a path, a process for doing something. It can shed light on amazing work being done. And it really is an avenue in order to do interesting work with great people.
Pam, I love what you just said there about how marketing shows up for you in a way that feels very human to me. And it's not about always about a business concept or some kind of construct. It's actually a very human to human type relationship that you're talking about there. So with that in mind, I'd love to ask you, when have you experienced really good marketing? And perhaps more importantly, what does that feel like to you?
There are a couple of instances, and one is when my kids went to get their braces for the first time. So it was our older son, Josh, who went, and I actually wrote about this in the book because I was so impressed. And it's funny because we wouldn't necessarily think about it as a marketing experience, but it absolutely was. We were referred to the McDonald Orthodontics, which is a dentistry right down the street from our kids' school. And we came in for the visit just to learn more about the experience. I was a little guarded, just thinking about gigantic bills one would have to pay to fill the kids' teeth with silver. And so from the moment we walked in, there was such a warm experience. It was very friendly. We immediately had somebody greet us, guide us through the space. And the space itself was physically just really designed in such an effective way. They walked right past the soft serve ice cream where they told the kids this is something they could have after they get their braces tightened, which was really smart to get the kids excited about that. And the entire experience of doing an initial exam, learning from the doctor different options was just so smooth. It was timely. It was organized. I had this feeling of confidence that they really knew what they were doing. And then at the end, they said, "Would you like to get the braces on today?" And I was just kind of shocked, like, what? And they said, we can do it today. And it was just requiring a US $163 down payment. They had a really good payment plan that you could do to make monthly payments. And it was just so smooth from start to finish. I was really, really excited. I never felt pressured. I was actually really drawn into wanting to work with a business that was so well organized.
There's a number of things in there which stood out for me. And that's a really inspiring story, by the way. I think, I was almost with you there. I could have really picture the experience. There was a number of things you mentioned there, which I thought were really fascinating, including not feeling pressured. But I'm curious, what did you learn from that experience in a way that you may embody that now in the work that you do and the way that you work?
I feel like I'm always learning things now. It's 26 years into business. I don't know if you have this sense. You've been in business a long time too, but sometimes it feels like I'm a total beginner every day as I learn something. What really struck me in that experience is the experience part. Thinking from the onset about the emotional, physical, cognitive experience that the potential client was going to have, and then designing the marketing around that. So often we think as business owners about our objectives. We want to close. We want to have the perfect landing page that converts. We're really thinking about a number of steps ahead. What is that experience where somebody might click on a link to use a credit card or put in an email to get a purchase order? And when you really back up from it and say, how could I create an amazing experience for somebody who's interested in working with me that is very respectful of where they are, what they need, and what's important to them? And that really changed a lot about the way that me and my entire team thought about the work we do with clients.
You're almost thinking about the service and the product, and then you're designing the marketing around that, but from the consumer or the customer's perspective, but really designing the experience there.
It is. And it's something in the world of business that folks talk about it generally in the context of customer experience. So there are, I think there's a book, I think it's called The Power of Moments, maybe by Dan and Chip Heath, which is a beautiful book that really goes into some detail about that, like really thinking about what the experience would be for somebody. But I don't find it so much attached to the way that we think about marketing. And part of this depends on where you lean in and listen and who you go to for advice. But a lot of the world, especially for online marketing, I know a lot of coaches or consultants that are aware of, there is very much a focus, in my opinion, of more of a transactional thing. You build the perfect funnel, you do these particular set of steps in order to get people to do what you want them to do. And I think it's really missing the fact that we're working with real human beings, and it's our job, even before somebody has given us any money, to really create an experience that they're going to feel good about.
Yeah. So with that in mind, and I think you're giving us some clues there, where do you see, you work with a lot of coaches yourself as a coach too. Where do you see a lot of coaches getting stuck with their marketing? What's stopping them from promoting their services when they've often got really good services and skills to offer, but at the same time, they do get stuck with this stuff? Where do you see that happening?
There are a number of different areas. Some of it is dependent upon who the person is and how they're wired and how it is that they are really socialized to think about marketing. But I think fundamentally, there is a focus too early on just tactics. And so a lot of people might come with a question, what do I need to do? What are the steps I need to do in order to activate my business? And to me, it's always stepping back and really thinking about, what is the mission of your business? Why are you really in this work? Why is it important to you? Why is it important to the world? And then what are your values? What are specific ways in which you choose to behave in the world? Core tenets that really guide your development of relationships and partnerships. And then from there, to be able to look in a context of saying, of all the different marketing strategies that I should lean into, what is one that's really aligned with my mission and my values? And that's a part, I think, that within that context, I'm talking in some ways about the solution before the problem, but it hits and addresses issues where people might say, I don't want to be that slimy person who's just manipulating people, to which I say sometimes, if they're a friend of mine, a little snarky, like, well, don't be that person. It's kind of as easy as that,
yeah.
Right? You do not have to be who you are not in order to market effectively.
Yeah.
But people might feel like they don't want to be that person who is marketing. People may feel overwhelmed by all the different tools and tactics. And they also might feel like they don't have time, which is a big one. Mm-hmm. They're passionate about doing the work and they feel like they don't have time to market their business. I always think about the metaphor of a garden. If you're looking at your garden and saying, I'm really sorry, I have all the time in the world to harvest your fruits and vegetables, but I don't have time to water you. That's essentially what it is that you're saying to your business when you say you don't have time to market.
So it's a bit of a mindset shift there. And I agree with you. I think sometimes it's that anxiety, that fear, that overwhelm, and that disconnect, actually. I think that's the thing that really stood out for me there in terms of who we truly are and what feels like the right thing to do versus all the tactics and strategies that we're often bombarded with or told about online and everywhere. And maybe that's what it is to some degree. Perhaps we don't realize we've got more options than what are available to us in terms of ways we could do marketing. So I think to some degree, what I was hearing there, Pam, it's about opening our minds up to what marketing might be. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, to your point there about making time for that, maybe we would make more time for it if the idea of marketing to us was more in alignment with who we are. And I wonder if it's as much to do with, it's not that we haven't got the time, it's just that we're not making the time because what it is that we feel marketing isn't what we want to do because that's out of alignment with who we are.
And I know enough about this model just to be very dangerous. So probably many of your listeners know much more. But one of my clients was passionate about a model of adult development that I thought was so interesting, just thinking about how we as adults go through stages of emotional maturity. And there's a component that I think also underlies our relationship with marketing that is related to a maturity in emotional development, which is, on one hand, we have agency, we have sovereignty. And sometimes I feel people just might say, I'm really good at what I do, but then completely crumble when it comes to looking at marketing, just looking to somebody else to tell them what to do and then to feel out of alignment or integrity. So that's one side of it. The other side that I see is sometimes an obstinance that you can see in teenagers, which is, I hate marketing. I'm not going to do it. I don't like it. And a real resistance to it. And on both sides of that equation, in a level of emotional maturity that we have when we take on the responsibility for creating a business. It's really a choice that you make about bringing a business to life. You never want to leave behind your agency. Even if you're in a new area and it doesn't make sense, you never want to leave behind your intuition, your judgment, your sense of something working or not, and being open to feedback. Is this just me? Is this just me being scared and therefore resistant? Or is this really something that I shouldn't be doing? And on the other hand, it's saying, if you are choosing to be in business, this is our garden water metaphor, your business needs marketing. And so as soon as you can really make a relationship with that truth and reality, the more then you can start to take some serious action.
Thank you for spelling that out for us. Coming back to something else you just said then about intuition, I also recognize where a lot of coaches get stuck with the marketing thing is because they feel that resistance, but they're sometimes unable to discern between whether it's their own fear of doing something or whether it's the right decision. So it may be that the step they need to take with their marketing, the resistance that they're feeling, they're unable to decide whether actually, or choose between, is this step feeling scary to me because it's a stretch, even though it might be the right decision to me? Or is this decision scary to me because it's actually out of alignment with me? And I know for some folks, they're having a really hard time trying to decide between, or to be able to discern between those two, perhaps subtly different, I suppose, senses of their own intuition. Could you speak to that a little bit, Pam? I mean, how do you know, if you know, whether the direction you're going in, maybe with your marketing or your business, is a stretch for you, but in the right direction versus something that's actually off the path?
It goes to doing the foundational work of really checking in at first and understanding about your mission and the core of why you're doing this work, and then also your values, because I think it's probably the consultant in me. Everything needs to have a decision matrix. This makes things so much easier where you reflect upon and then you document criteria in general that you use in order to check your business decisions. Because in this case, it could be marketing. It can also be, should I work with this client? Should I do this particular project? Should I work with this business? And we learn iteratively by testing and trying things sometimes that get us close to what in the book I referred to the concept my friend Greg Hartle calls the hypocrisy line, which is as we get close to the edge of our values and ethics, we can start to have this feeling that if I cross over, I'm going to be doing something that will fundamentally not be in integrity with who I am. And so in order to do that, there needs to be a period of reflection. You need to really document and write down what your thoughts are. And then there's the testing and trying to see whether it works or not. So that's one piece of it. Is I'm a big intuition person. I've always operated a lot with feelings, and I also like to look and check that with things like decision integrity. The other piece of it is my friend Jonathan Fields calls it a body of evidence, and so that is, you might say, I could never run an email sequence in order to promote a program because I feel like I'm just bothering people by showing up in their inbox all the time. That never works. Then you might look at people who you consider to be folks you admire, who may use an email marketing system, and maybe you can find in the way in which they do that, it doesn't to you as the consumer feel like something that's overwhelming, or you end up recognizing that what service you're delivering is so important that it's worth it of doing a little bit of interruption for folks. And also, if people really are not interested in your business at all, then maybe it's not the best place for people to be on your business mailing list, and that's okay. So those, I think, are the two things where when you know yourself and you have some criteria, you test it and refine that as you operate. And then you do look for people where you say, is it really true that nobody with integrity could ever use this marketing tactic? And that's, I think, often where style or approach comes in. And it's been really helpful to me to see people I really admire use certain tactics that might have felt uncomfortable to me before.
That's fascinating, Pam. I really like what you're saying there about almost finding your own groove, really, finding your own style, and somewhat curating in your own mind what that might look like based upon people you yourself admire and see doing a version of perhaps what you might not like elsewhere, but in a way that feels that it could be in alignment with you. But what I also heard there too was an element of actually experimenting with this stuff and almost training your intuition so that you can actually develop that discernment and that ability to be able to constantly refine, which I know is something else that you talk about in your book and in your other work as well, in terms of that almost that constant innovation and continual improvement.
There is the side to it that is exciting when you do look at every aspect of your business as your body of work, hence the title of my last book. But when you're really thinking of what you're creating and how you create it and how it is that you get the word out, how you work with people, it is exciting and interesting to constantly be innovating that and working on it. And that, I think, for a lot of coaches and consultants I work with, is more the core of what gets them excited rather than just make $1 million. Like, I love money. Money's wonderful. It gives us access to so many things. And it's very exciting when that unlocks in a business. And I love working with people, around that area. But I know for myself, it's not the driver. It wouldn't be the driving motivator to say, just trust me, use this marketing tactic because you're going to make X dollars. It just wouldn't be enough to get me over a hump of doing something that might feel a little bit scary.
That's really interesting to me in the sense that it's not just about following tactics. It's not necessarily always following strategies, or quotes proven strategies, to be able to help you achieve certain things in marketing, which is what we often hear so much of when it comes to marketing, particularly on social media. This is very much about actually coming back to what you were saying earlier, designing it in a way so that we are thinking about our customers first in terms of their experience and what they're experiencing, and then leading them into the service, which I suppose kind of gets us into this concept that you go into some depth in your book, The Widest Net, about the ecosystem and having your own ecosystem. So let's get into a little bit of that, because I'd love to ask you about, firstly, actually, I'll start here by asking you, what do you mean by an ecosystem in this context, Pam?
The big idea of the book is contrasting what I call empire culture, which is really about literally using language like building an empire that sometimes we use in business. And I think sometimes it's with a wink and in jest, but other times there really is that feeling that you have about crushing and dominating and really building this soul empire in which you have to position yourself as the unique expert. And it's all about dominating competitors and proving the fact to your market that you are the very best. This is contrasted with a lot of my experience, which is when you take an example of an ideal client. And just to use a real example, I work with a lot of folks who are building certification and licensing programs. So they build a significant amount of IP, and they're really looking to scale that through some kind of certification and licensing program. So I can do my work with them as a business advisor, but there are naturally places in person and online where they are also looking for information, tools, resources, and support in order to completely solve their problem, which usually is getting all the way through that stage of business and where they can unlock that revenue and they can really experience that business success. So in that, I, for The Widest Net, created an ecosystem wheel that has 10 different slices. And so examples of that would be other service providers who are also working with them. Every single client I work with in these areas are also working with a CPA, and very often a profit-first CPA from the great book that Mike Michalowicz wrote about profitability. They're working with intellectual property attorneys, business attorneys, graphic designers. Many are thought leaders. They're working with podcast producers like yourself. And so just in that particular slice of service providers are all these other people who are really aligned with you around solving the problem for the business owner. And then that's not to mention media hubs. They might listen to podcasts, they read publications, they use products and services. A lot of the services and the software as a service, SaaS companies, are providing all kinds of tools that these clients and customers are using to scale their business. So instead of just worrying about pulling everybody into your individual empire, I say, look to the places where already other amazing people have gathered a community of those ideal clients. And when you connect there, when you become part of that ecosystem, that to me is really where you start to get some resonance and momentum and scale.
That's really exciting. So part of what you're describing there in that ecosystem then is aligning with other professionals, other services, other people, and maybe even software and technology and teams behind that software and technology that are also in alignment with you, but perhaps serving the same people that you're serving too. Is that right, Pam?
That's right. So I know in my own business, I do a lot of work in brand partnerships with people who work with small business owners, with GoDaddy, with Keep, used to be known as Infusionsoft, with Progressive Insurance. So when I'm connecting with them and usually creating content for their audience, it also gives me exposure into sometimes thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who I never would have been able to have access to had they not gathered folks together. So it really is, I don't know if people are Marvel or DC, so I hope I don't make anybody mad, but it's like the Justice League. And often as a fun metaphor, I say, if you wanted to completely solve the problem of your ideal clients and you had 30 minutes or less to do it or the world would destruct, who would be this Justice League of experts that you would assemble in order to just provide the best guidance to help them solve their problem? That's a way of thinking about the best ecosystem, are all of these different partners who could completely solve the problem of your ideal client.
I love that. I'm not an expert, but I've got a feeling that might be Marvel, but my kids will correct me if
I think it's DC.
Is it DC?
But I know I'm sketchy as well. I don't know as much as I should.
You might be right, actually. So anyway, we'll move on from that. That's lovely, Pam, and really great to hear. And I like this idea of assembling together people, experts that we know, in order to save the world, and to think of it that way. Actually, that's a great exercise to do, isn't it? It's to just give ourselves a short period of time and write those names down and build that idea of who those people would actually be.
It's a great exercise to do. And usually when people begin with it, they have a short list because it's really a way of looking at the world that's a little bit different, especially in the context of marketing. Once you begin to train yourself to listen, first of all, to your clients and notice who they talk about, and then sometimes to ask them very specifically. One of the exercises from the book is to look for some of your ideal clients who you love working with and ask them, do you have any favorite service professionals that you're working with to solve the similar problem that I'm helping you solve? And would you feel comfortable making an introduction just so we could get to know each other? This is for somebody you know well, that you feel comfortable asking that. If not, you could just first ask who are people who they work with. The second thing is there a favorite podcast or blog that you read around this topic? And then the third one is there, of all the events that you could go to, what would be the one that would be the most exciting to you? Because events are super nodes of connections. Often there are all kinds of ideal clients in the audience. The presenters are often what I call peanut butter and jelly partners, so highly complementary but non-competitive partners that shed light on different parts of solving the problem. And the sponsors are very often larger companies that serve that particular market. So with a few questions to begin and to begin to collect data, this is one of the elements of the widest net method that becomes a way that you see the world and type of business information that you track on a regular basis.
That's great. Something you just mentioned there, Pam, reminded me of one of your newsletters from earlier this year, one of your email newsletters, where you addressed the subject of a niche or niche for the American audience. There's a lot of wisdom in the world of marketing and business today about going narrow and deep into a specific niche. But what I was fascinated about what you wrote in your newsletter was that can actually limit your opportunities sometimes, depending on your perspective of what a niche or a niche is. What's the trick there, Pam? Can you sort of enlighten our listener as to when it's a good time to sort of go deep and narrow, but then also to go wide with your niche?
The strategic lens that I take to it is that, in general, to be very specific about who it is that you're trying to reach with as much defining criteria that allows you to find them as possible is a good thing. The place I think where sometimes folks get tripped up is they will zero in on a niche too soon before really taking time to explore the totality of the market. And that's really where you open up and you can look at all of the opportunities. You can look at the different spots in the ecosystem wheel where there might be good ideas for partnerships. Then when you do some discovery, you develop decision criteria. You think about what you're looking for in those markets. What's the nature of the relationships? How does your experience align with them? I know for some people who might be a little bit newer in the coaching industry, they might be coming from long time professional experiences where they were working as an employee, but they may not have as much direct experience as a coach. And so sometimes in those areas, you can look for places where your professional experience prior to being independent is already going to be giving you some credibility if you don't happen to have decades of experience behind you as a coach. So these are the kinds of things that you want to zoom out first, then narrow in and test, try, experiment, notice the areas that really start to have some connection, in which case that, as a building block for a business model, can be a great way to really lean in and go deep and find the way that you can be building more of an automated, and I don't mean automated in not having a human touch, but a very process-driven, operation clean approach to how it is that you work with those customers. And if that's really humming, or maybe you have other people working with you in that segment of the market, then you can begin to activate some of these other ideas.
It's really nice to hear your take on that, because I think, again, it's almost a level of discernment that I spot. And myself, I experience this too. Sometimes just knowing what the sweet spot is in terms of how wide and how narrow you go with something like that. But to your point there, it's about experimenting, getting feedback, responding to that feedback, rather than sort of, and again, I can speak to my own experience here in the earlier days, being quite stubborn about something having to work this way. And actually, to your earlier point, sort of zooming out, listening to the customer, speaking to the customer and asking, what else is going on in their world, and trying to understand the world from their perspective, because I think that can often greatly inform how our own ecosystem could look, and also where our services are positioned.
It's true. So the other thing I was eager to say about niches that I think trips people up is very often they're narrowly defined as a specific demographic component to a niche. So saying you can only work with financial consultants, or you could only work with women aged 25 to 35 in London. And really what becomes rich is where you're defining your audience per the method in the book that is from Susan Beyer, who's an amazing audience segmentation researcher who I refer to in the book, from Audience Audit, which is her site. She says we really want to be defining our ideal client as somebody who has a problem or a challenge that we can solve. And sometimes you want to add demographics after, but you really want to be focused in that area. So for you, thinking about the amazing work you do in getting podcasts up and running, and your deep background you have in audio engineering, if you're saying your niche is only to work with coaches, knowing you, that could feel quite constricting. Instead, if you're thinking, I want to work with extremely talented people who are thought leaders in their space, who are amazing at what they do, but feel like they just don't quite understand how they can get up and running with a podcast. Once they get it rolling, once we build a system in place, they've demonstrated that they can really continue that over time. I mean, that's a long-winded off the cuff example, but this could mean that you could be working with scientists and astronauts and coaches and all kinds of people, but in an area that might also be aligned with work you're passionate about doing.
Oh, it's nice to be the subject of a great example there, Pam, of what you're talking about. But that's really helped me understand it. So that's really, really great. And thank you for bringing that concept to life, because I find that's a hard one to articulate for many folks. But I recognise, and again, speaking from my own experience, that's what we're up against here, and what we're grappling with is trying to understand, there's so many different ways that we can, quote, pivot our business. And sometimes it's not about changing the service or the product that we're actually offering. It's sometimes about changing the market, or changing the area of the market that we're serving and how we're serving it. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And you've just reminded me of that very important point, Pam. So yeah, thank you for that. Moving on, I want to ask you again from a more practical point of view, something you talk about in the book, and something I've had direct experience with you in a group setting before with, is this concept of tiny marketing actions. And I'd love to know how, in your words, how that fits into the ecosystem concept that you were describing earlier, but also perhaps how that concept could benefit somebody who hasn't ever come across that term or that concept before, and maybe think of marketing their coaching services or their business from that point of view.
Absolutely. So the idea of tiny marketing actions is really born from work I was doing with clients, where I found if somebody was in a state where they were really stuck where they were, maybe their business had stalled, they're frustrated, that it was overwhelming to begin to always talk about the big strategic pieces or to do a gigantic launch. What they needed was just this habit of really taking small steps every day in order to build connections. It's based on a body of work around habits, great books like Atomic Habits by James Clear or Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg. Both are excellent recommendations for coaches and everything else that we do. But the research really says that if we're instituting these small habits, it doesn't feel like you have to have this gigantic lift of time and energy when you're doing your marketing. the metaphor I like to think about a lot, having just traveled, my family took a wonderful trip to the UK. We went to London and to Scotland, and then we went to Paris, which was lovely. In some ways, it helps to get you oriented. So you might do the strategic work. For us, when we were locked down in quarantine and I was writing my book, we desperately needed something to look forward to and to plan. So as we zoomed out and thought of all the places in the world where we'd want to go, where would be some starting places, and that's where we started to zoom in on, in particular, Scotland. That was the starting place because I had never been, and that's where my family history is from. Once we zoomed in there, it gave us a very specific place to really think about how to build a plan. And that's where we took these tiny steps to begin to research, to plot the trip, to get into the detail and the nuances. So if we think about it that way, for folks who love to travel like we do, at first you need to do the strategic analysis about where is the first place to start. And so that leans on what we said before. Is it really leaning in at first to look for some good partnerships with other service providers? Do we want to have a strategy that's focused on being a guest on podcasts that our ideal clients listen to? And once we zoom in on that, then the tiny marketing actions are going to be really small things, like first just listening to the episodes in the case of a podcast. Then maybe we have a way to connect with a podcast host on LinkedIn. Take the time to really get to know somebody without immediately jumping into asking somebody, could I be a guest on your show? And that's, I think, where a lot of people fall down, is they don't take the time to build relationships before asking for something in return.
There's a lot of great stuff in your book, Pam, about actually developing and then cultivating those relationships, particularly from cold in a business setting, which again, I know a lot of us have to do. And that it's almost a necessity in terms of finding clients and other supporting partners in order to deliver the services that we do. What are some of your best tips in terms of, I know a lot of great coaches that are really, really good coaches, but they would hold their hand up and say quite categorically that they are introverts, particularly in sort of physical, social sort of networking scenarios, conferences and that kind of thing. So for our listener who, if they can relate to what I'm describing there, what are some of your best tips from the book in terms of how they can get started in terms of making those connections, developing those relationships without feeling too awkward or perhaps a little bit, going back to what we were saying earlier, out of alignment with who they are?
Yes, I am a self-identified extrovert for sure, but I work with the author Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet, for about 18 months, and have so much appreciation for the focus. So if you are somebody who identifies as more introverted, and also if you're somebody who's extroverted, the first piece is really in looking at the strategy. So you do have a sense of what are these places in which you want to begin to make some connections. And then from there, to really think about slow ways that you can begin to plant seeds, much the same way you might if you were going up and you were casually talking to somebody in line at a cafe. I always say we wouldn't walk into a cafe, walk up to an unknown person in line in front of us and say, "Hi, would you like to buy my product or hire me to work for you?" We would never do that. And therefore, we shouldn't do that online. You want to spend time first listening and really getting to know, observing if there are key partners you're interested in, or a podcast you're passionate about, or maybe products that you're really excited about using. Begin to lean in and learn more about it at first. And then we're often just doing a general connection on LinkedIn, where you might at first just profess your interest in connecting with somebody. That is something that can be a good way to make a genuine connection. Pay attention to the kind of information that somebody is posting. And then from that, you can begin to develop a little bit more of a friendly relationship online. And then over time, can look for places where that person is. I know sometimes it sounds a little stalker-esque when people realize the strategy behind different connections, but where you really are sincerely passionate about another service provider or maybe a brand who you really want to work with, you want to do everything you can to get yourself in alignment with them. So you might tune in and pay attention to their content. You might show up at a place where a favorite thought leader is speaking and take the time to be in line and meet them face to face for the first time. And so there's a part of it that really is slow, getting to know each other. Sometimes, because there's just a natural connection and you might reach out to somebody for the first time, It doesn't mean that it has to take that much time, but there's a planning in doing that outreach. Once you do feel like there's a good reason to connect with each other, one of the examples I used in the book is my client, Heather Krause, who's an amazing data scientist in Toronto, very self-professed introvert. In fact, she said, if somebody gets to know me at my Starbucks, I'll drive 10 kilometers to the next one just so they won't know me. And it was so fun to work on this strategy with her because she was very clear. She didn't want to waste time, hers or others. And she was not inherently passionate about community building, but she was extremely passionate about getting her work out into the world to reduce bias in data science. And so she began to do these 15-minute conversations with people whose work was directly aligned with hers. And it has been amazing and astounding to see the impact. She's ended up growing a huge community, has very effective training. She's trained thousands of data scientists and is doing important work with many large institutions and academic and otherwise.
Yeah, that's an incredible example there of just how you can find your own path in terms of doing this sort of stuff and developing that ecosystem that we were talking about earlier. There are a couple of chapters in your book that I wanted to also just bring into our conversation today, which really stood out for me, particularly in the context of this particular series, Make Time for Your Marketing. And one of those chapters perhaps relates to the point that we were just covering there about cultivating relationships. And that's chapter 6, where it talks about the seeds that you plant and the importance of that. But also the other one that kind of stands out in my mind for the context of this conversation today is the ecosystem that you protect. So I was just wondering if you could perhaps summarize why those are important themes for you and perhaps why they were included in the book, why they're important today, and perhaps if we are going to spend time on our marketing, how spending more time on those aspects could benefit us in terms of the services that we have to offer as coaches.
Yeah, so the first piece, they really do work together because when you do begin to zero in on the type of marketing and the segments of the ecosystem that you know really work for you, and breaking down those activities into these small, tiny marketing actions gives you a very clear idea about the kinds of seeds that you want to plant. So thinking about it from a weekly and monthly, annual perspective, you can begin to set very specific operational metrics in place where you're really thinking about marketing operations, because that's what it is. The garden needs to be watered on a consistent basis according to season. And so when you begin to look at this, you can give yourself time in order to be planting seeds, but in a way that's discerned and in a way that you can be really tracking the particular outcome of those activities. And so that's a place I think that where while you're not being overbearing, you're planting seeds, you're letting relationships naturally grow. This is one of these examples that as soon as you're in it, let's say about a quarter's worth of time, about 3 months, you do begin to notice certain seeds that pop. Many people get frustrated, which I understand. It can feel like you're not doing enough. But this is a longer term strategy that has a cumulative effect and momentum, that when you're consistently doing these activities, things start to pop that then give you information about what you really want to operationalize. The other piece about it in terms of protecting your ecosystem is where you are relationship based, you have spent all this time to cultivate a very authentic, trustworthy relationship with folks in your ecosystem. And so you don't want to be transactional a way that you might share information with others. I have people, understandably, who might be raised in more of a tactical environment who might say, I notice you're connected to this person. Can you introduce me? And I don't know this person. I would never do that because I want to really respect the time and the relationships the other person has. And so you want to be very thoughtful about how it is that you introduce folks to others. And this is a part of it, I think, that takes, again, this level of maturity and adult development. It can be extremely awkward. I know I've had folks, I've been really lucky to have amazing people blurb my books or have personal relationships, people like Dan Pink or Guy Kawasaki, Brene Brown. And it is understandable, and I always appreciate somebody's bold ask, sometimes as friends who might say, would you mind introducing me to so-and-so because I want them to blurb my book? And I always say, first of all, usually with folks that have a lot of people coming at them because they're famous or have a certain level of, large audience, I would always ask them before introducing, but usually I might have a sense of what is the preferred method that they have for making introductions. Very often they say, just route the person through my regular channels because they have a team in place for a reason. What's awkward is where it might be a friend of mine. I might feel awkward, but I might know intuitively that I do not want to be burning that relationship just to be introducing somebody to somebody else. So that's where I try to practice what I preach. And I'm very clear and direct and say, I so appreciate you taking that bold step. The relationship that I have with them means that I'm going to recommend that you approach them this way. And I don't generally do direct introductions. And that to me has allowed me to have a lot of really rich relationships all across the board in different dimensions, not just people who are famous, but people who also might tire of people constantly coming at them, wanting something from them.
Mm. Yeah, that's lovely, Pam, and really useful to hear in the context of what we're talking about today. So I think it also perhaps gives a little bit of insight and maybe permission to people to try something different or respect or understand perhaps when they aren't getting the results that they're looking for, and perhaps they're trying those sorts of approaches, what might be going on there behind the scenes. But also as our own ecosystems evolve and our connections and relationships deepen with people, the actual importance of actually the value of those relationships, and I suppose the responsibility that comes with developing that ecosystem. That's what I'm also hearing there as we do this work, as we perform some of the stuff that we've been talking about today, and as we grow both our businesses and ourselves, there's more at stake. And there is more that we have to look after, more we have to cultivate, more that we actually have to protect in the context of our lives and our business. Pam, it's been fascinating to talk to you today and learn more about marketing from the widest net perspective. I'm curious, you mentioned a number of resources today, and you also mentioned adult maturity there, which I think a number of coaches, even the more experienced coaches listening to this podcast today, would be interested in. Have you got any resources that you think would be useful?
There are some specific resources that I have related to the book. I was talking about the ecosystem wheel and the different segments. I have every single exercise from the book that is in a workbook that is available, no email trade required. That's on PamelaSlim.com/the widest net. We can put a link in the show notes, and that's going to have all kinds of hands-on resources for you to implement some of these pieces. The other two books I mentioned, Atomic Habits by James Clear and Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg, are really great to help reinforce this idea that there really is behavioral science behind instituting an approach in your marketing where you look at the strategic picture, you make discerned decisions about where to focus, and then you take these small steps to institute ongoing and sustainable change. This kind of approach will not only transform your marketing, it's going to transform your entire life and your business, and I highly recommend them. The adult development, I just know it from conversations with my clients, so maybe we can, between the two of us, Google some resources because I am actually fascinated to dig in more, but I don't have a link handy right now.
That's lovely. Thanks for sharing those, Pam. So for our listener, you can find all of those links that Pam mentioned there in the show notes on the associationforcoaching.com's website. And just to wrap up then, Pam, I'd love to ask you, is there anything you'd love to add in the context of our conversation today for our listener?
What I often tell new clients that I'm working with is it can feel so overwhelming to begin to approach something that's felt foggy or vague or overwhelming or frightening before. I really believe in the power of a process and a model. And that's why I think I feel so passionate about looking at the way that steps interlock in order to have an intended result. Part of what happens when we think of marketing is really creating a Frankenstein model of just one piece from something and one piece from the other. And that's often why we end up feeling so out of alignment. And I think about it in our earlier metaphor of travel. If we do a great job identifying the continent, the city where we want to go, we make an amazing itinerary, we figure out the restaurants, we figure out exactly how we're getting there in transportation, and we forget to book a plane ticket, all of that work is for naught. And so there is a method to the madness. you want to first just look at the way that pieces interlock. And then when you're implementing something new, just start with a few steps that can get you rolling and testing in the market. And it's this zooming out and zooming in on an ongoing basis that's going to give you insight and eventually give you a really solid business model that you can start to operationalize.
Pam, it's been wonderful chatting with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. I'm Rob Lawrence. For 20 years, the AC's purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and societies worldwide. To find out more about the Association for Coaching and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or explore our website at associationforcoaching.com. You can keep up to date with our latest podcast episodes, enjoy the wealth of digital learning offerings, and gain insights from our Coaching Perspectives magazine.